Hey guys, tonight we're stepping out of the dungeons and into the royal halls, but before you imagine golden crowns, feast the size of villages, and servants peeling grapes for you on command, hold that thought. Because being a medieval king, it kind of sucked. So dim the lights, fluff your pillows, and let's set the record straight about monarchy in the Middle Ages. And if you're tuning in from somewhere around the world, let me know in the comments what time it is for you. Always fascinating to see who else is lying in bed wondering how horrible royal life could actually be. Let's begin. No one becomes a king for the quiet life. But medieval kings? They weren't sipping wine and waving lazily from balconies. They were constantly being poisoned, plotted against, or pressured to invade someone for looking at them the wrong way. Forget crown polishers and banquet dancers. Half the time, a king was just trying not to get murdered by his cousin. First of all, let's talk about social life, or rather, the complete lack of it. If you were king, you couldn't just have friends. Everyone around you was either trying to marry their daughter into your bloodline, get a slice of your treasury, or stab you in your sleep and take your castle. The moment you put on that crown, every relationship turned into a political calculation. Best friends, that's adorable. Now execute him because someone spread a rumour he talked to your brother about your wife. And speaking of wives, medieval royal marriage was less romance, more hostage negotiation. Kings didn't marry for love. They married for land, for alliances, or to end wars. Your bride was often 12 years old, spoke zero of your language, and arrived at your castle with a flock of whispering advisers and the emotional range of a diplomatic treaty. Meanwhile, your mistress was probably poisoning your wine out of jealousy, and your in-laws were busy plotting your overthrow from the guest room. Financially, a royal nightmare. Sure, kings had gold, but they also had massive expenses, paying knights, bribing barons, throwing tournaments, building cathedrals to impress the Pope, and feeding a court of 300 nobles who all demanded 5-course meals every night. Taxation was a gamble. If you pushed too hard, you'd spark a rebellion. Too soft, and you couldn't afford to keep your personal guard from selling you to France. Then there was politics. Remember student council drama in school? Now imagine it with swords. Kings had to manage lords, dukes, bishops, mercenaries, popes, foreign monarchs, and every single cousin with a claim to your throne. One bad harvest, one poorly timed marriage, one papal insult, and boom, civil war. And if you tried to make reforms, your own nobles would band together and lock you in a tower faster than you could say tax reform. And let's not ignore the health hazards. Kings were expected to lead their armies into battle, which meant you weren't just a symbol, you were also a target. Arrows didn't care about royal blood, neither did dysentery, smallpox or leeches. Medical care involved sawing off limbs, bleeding you with knives and praying. And God help you if your court physician was more into astrology than actual healing. Oh, and privacy. Non-existent. Your every move was watched. Advisors, priests, spies, and servants. It was like living in a reality show where the prize was not being overthrown. Even your bedchamber wasn't safe. There are records of noblemen sleeping outside a king's room just to protect him. Or, wait for him to slip up. And here's the kicker. If you were too strong, everyone feared you. If you were too weak, everyone replaced you. It was a tightrope over a pit of swords, and the rope was soaked in oil. Take King Edward II, for example. He showed too much affection for his male favourites, spent too little time appeasing his nobles, and ended up imprisoned and possibly murdered by a red-hot poker. Seriously. And King John? He lost Normandy, raised taxes, angered barons, and got bullied into signing the Magna Carta. His nickname was Soft Sword, not exactly kingly. But hey, at least you had the crown, right? Next, we dive deeper into the first layer of royal misery, the love life. Because when your marriage is a treaty, your mistress is a spy, and your bedroom has more politics than a parliament, romance goes straight out the stained glass window. If you thought your dating life was complicated, imagine having to consult your chancellor, 3 bishops and the Pope before making a move. Welcome to medieval royal romance, where every kiss had geopolitical consequences, and love letters were vetted like war declarations. Let's start with the basics. Medieval kings did not marry for passion, companionship, or compatibility. They married for land, peace treaties, and very often the consolidation of dynastic claims, which is historian speak for marry the cousin, inherit the sheep. Wives were not chosen, they were delivered, like expensive, politically strategic furniture. You didn't get to swipe right. You got a scroll from a neighbouring kingdom that read, "Dear sire, we would like to offer our 13-year-old daughter and 5 hectares of swampland in exchange for peace." You said yes, not because you were in love, but because you were tired of the border skirmishes. And it didn't stop at the awkward wedding night, which often involved a translator, a bishop, and the entire court watching you walk into the bedroom to consummate the treaty. No pressure, especially when your new bride didn't speak your language, had been raised in a convent and was still wondering whether she was allowed to make eye contact with you. Now mistresses, kings had them, lots of them. It was practically expected. The problem? Everyone else at court also expected to benefit from them. That charming noblewoman warming your bed, she came with 6 brothers and a political agenda. You thought it was romance. It was a hostile takeover wrapped in perfume. Some kings tried to keep it discreet. Others, like Charles II of England, just went ahead and built their mistresses mansions. To be fair, he was post-medieval, but the drama still applies. In the Middle Ages, kings walked a fine line between passionate affair and international incident. And let's not forget the constant paranoia. Every affair was a scandal waiting to explode. Nobles would accuse the queen of adultery to undermine her family's power. The queen's faction would spread rumours about the mistress poisoning the royal wine. Meanwhile, the pope was always one scroll away from declaring your marriage invalid, which could trigger a succession crisis and war. All because you got bored and made eye contact with the wrong lady at a jousting tournament. Some kings tried to get around this mess with secret marriages. Bad idea. Edward IV of England married Elizabeth Woodville in secret, which basically set off a family feud so violent it became an entire historical era. The Wars of the Roses. Imagine your private elopement causing 30 years of civil war. That's romance with consequences. Of course, some kings didn't even get a say in their own love life. Political pressures meant they were sometimes forced to abandon women they actually liked, just to make way for a more advantageous union. Fall in love with a commoner? Cute. Now exile her or lose your throne. And then there were the children. Royal heirs were everything. Producing a son wasn't just a biological task, it was a political requirement. If the queen failed to deliver, the blame usually fell squarely on her shoulders. But if she succeeded? Great. Now your own nobles are plotting to control the child and use him as leverage against you. Worst of all, you couldn't even trust your own bedchamber. Servants were spies. Ladies-in-waiting were gossip machines. Courtiers bribed your chambermaids just to get details about who you were sleeping with and whether you looked happy doing it. Take the case of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. They were a true medieval power couple, until they weren't. After years of marriage, infidelity, rebellion, from both Eleanor and their sons, and royal tantrums, he imprisoned her for over a decade. Royal marriage, not exactly couple goals. Or poor Louis X of France. His Queen Margaret was accused of adultery, caught allegedly in a tower with a pair of knights. She was imprisoned and may have been strangled to death, depending on which version of history you read. Either way, it wasn't a Valentine's Day card ending. And then there's the infamous case of Edward II, whose deep affection for his male favourites, particularly Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, caused massive friction at court. His nobles weren't just angry, some were murderous. The love triangle at the heart of his reign eventually led to his downfall and death, by one of the most famously grotesque methods in royal rumour mill history. So no, royal romance wasn't moonlight and roses. It was land grabs and liability management. And while you may have had a castle, a crown, and an elaborate canopy bed, your love life was less rom-com and more war room. Next, we take a hard look at another layer of royal misery, money. Because when the crown sits on your head, but you owe more than half your kingdom in debts to knights, barons, and a very angry pope. Things get expensive fast, so we just peeled back the veil on the royal misery of politics and constant threats. But now let's slip into the even thornier thicket of the medieval king's love life. If you thought politics was a minefield, wait until you meet the tangled mess that was romance, marriage, and all the sticky stuff in between, because for kings, love wasn't exactly what the bard sang about. Picture this. You're a king, probably barely out of your teens, and you're expected to marry a woman who's often a complete stranger, sometimes as young as 12, shipped in from a distant kingdom, maybe speaking a language you don't understand. And no, you're not allowed to be the romantic type. This marriage? It's a contract, a political chess move, a way to secure alliances or grab territory. Forget candlelit dinners and stolen kisses. Your wedding night is less romantic comedy and more awkward treaty signing. Worse yet, your bride probably arrived with an entourage of advisors, handlers and chaperones who treat her like the crown jewels themselves, which in many ways she was. Any sign of affection or independence? Not allowed. Every letter she wrote was likely monitored. She had to bear heirs, preferably sons, or face a fate worse than a bad haircut. Queens weren't just wives, they were dynastic machines. And then there were mistresses, because kings, they rarely stuck to one woman. A mistress wasn't just a secret lover, she was often a political player in her own right, wielding influence over the king's decisions behind the scenes. Some mistresses came from noble families eager to improve their standings. Others were the daughters of merchants, courtesans with wit and charm sharp enough to pierce court intrigues. Their power, it was precarious, dependent entirely on the king's favour, and that favour could vanish overnight. Now imagine the king's wife, usually the official queen, finding out her husband's dalliances. Was there drama? Of course. Poisonings? Scandalous accusations? Absolutely. Some queens took it with icy grace. Others plotted revenge so meticulous it could have inspired the darkest plays. But one thing's certain. Royal love life was as treacherous as the battlefield. Historically, kings like Henry VIII of England famously had multiple wives, divorces and executions. But even before him, medieval kings had complicated relationships. The Capetians in France were notorious for their extramarital escapades, and English kings like Edward II had favourites whose influence over the throne caused real political upheaval. Yet sometimes love sparked in the unlikeliest of places. There are tales of kings falling deeply for a commoner or a foreign princess, challenging conventions and upsetting entire courts. These were rare moments of vulnerability in an otherwise brutal existence. But let's not forget the emotional toll. The king's marriage was a public spectacle, a union of kingdoms, not of hearts. Intimacy was often sacrificed on the altar of duty. The loneliness, the pressure to produce heirs, and the constant fear of betrayal took a psychological toll we rarely consider. Letters from kings reveal their frustrations and desires, but the personal voice is often muffled by protocol and the expectations of monarchy. Even children born into these marriages lived precarious lives, caught between alliances and rivalries. Princes and princesses were pawns in a high-stakes game of survival, with their futures dictated by shifting political winds rather than affection. And what about love affairs? They weren't just about pleasure. Some were carefully orchestrated by factions seeking influence. A mistress could sway decisions, a favoured noblewoman could push policies, and an affair could ignite factional wars. Court gossip wasn't idle chatter, it was survival information. So yes, the medieval king's love life was a complicated mess of duty, desire, power, and danger. It was anything but fairy tale romance. And through it all, kings had to smile for the court, keep the peace in their chambers, and remember that every whispered secret could be a dagger aimed at their throne. Up next, we'll peel back the next layer, the brutal financial reality of keeping a crown on your head. Spoiler, having gold doesn't mean you're rich. especially when everyone around you is hungry for your treasure. So now that we've navigated the stormy seas of royal love, awkward marriages, scheming mistresses and emotional landmines, it's time to talk about something every king faces: money. Or more accurately, the maddening struggle of having gold but never feeling rich. Being a medieval king might look like a non-stop gold rush from the outside. After all, crowns gleam with jewels, thrones are carved from ivory and gold, and courts dazzle with silk and feasts. But the truth? It was more like trying to keep a leaky bucket full of coins while everyone around you pokes holes in it. Here's the deal. A king's wealth wasn't just his own. It was everyone's business. Nobles, knights, bishops, mercenaries, peasants, and foreign powers all had their hands out, and none of them were shy about asking for their cut. Taxes were the lifeblood of the kingdom, but collecting them was a tightrope act. Push too hard and your people revolt. Go easy and your treasury runs dry before the winter frost settles. Take the cost of war, for example. Medieval warfare wasn't cheap. Knights needed armour that could cost a small village's yearly income. Horses had to be fed, soldiers paid, weapons forged. A single campaign could drain the royal coffers, and often did. Remember that splendid coronation feast? It probably cost the king half a year's income, and wasn't just for show. It was a statement, a reminder to nobles who held power that the king could still throw a party bigger than theirs. But what if you couldn't afford those feasts? Suddenly your nobles stop showing up. They start questioning your strength. Doubt creeps in like a plague. And nobles, being nobles, loved nothing more than a weak king to rally against. To cover expenses, kings often resorted to creative taxation. Think special assessments on everything from grain to salt to ale. The problem? Everyone hates new taxes. Peasants grumble, merchants bribe, and bishops preach sermons against royal greed. The infamous poll taxes and levies sometimes sparked outright rebellion, like the English peasants' revolt of 1381. So every coin was a gamble. Tax too much, and your kingdom burns. Tax too little, and your guards sell their swords to the highest bidder. Then there were the debts. Yes, kings could, and often did, borrow money from wealthy merchants, foreign banks, and even the church. But interest rates weren't friendly. Fail to repay, and suddenly you're under the Pope's spiritual thumb or worse, facing mercenaries hired by your creditors marching at your gates. A king's credit score? Let's just say it wasn't stellar. And we haven't even talked about maintaining the court itself. Imagine a castle buzzing with hundreds of nobles, knights, advisors, servants, artists, minstrels, and cooks. Each one had demands: food, wine, clothes, gifts. The king's wardrobe alone was a fortune: silks, furs, and jewels that could buy armies. His bedroom? A palace within a palace, filled with tapestries to keep out the cold, and enough gold thread to blind an enemy in battle. Building projects were another black hole for royal finances. Castles needed repairs, churches needed rebuilding, and infrastructure had to impress both subjects and foreign dignitaries. The church expected donations. Nobles wanted their estates improved, and the king, he had to look powerful. Nothing says, "I'm your ruler," like a massive stone fortress looming over a village. Even the king's personal guard was a costly necessity. These knights and men-at-arms were paid handsomely, or risked switching sides. Loyalty was a commodity, not a given. Skimp on pay, and suddenly your loyal guard is found sleeping with your enemies or selling secrets. In short, being a medieval king was like running a business with zero profits, mounting debts, and an army of stakeholders ready to overthrow you at the first sign of weakness. Your gold might fill coffers, but it rarely bought peace of mind. And yet, despite all the stress and financial juggling, kings had to project strength. A king in rags was a joke. A bankrupt king was a dead king. So they smiled through the pain, hosted those lavish feasts, and pretended the treasury was full. Next up, we'll dive into the thorny world of medieval politics, where one wrong word, one misplaced alliance, or one slighted noble could set the kingdom ablaze. Spoiler: it's basically like high school drama. with swords, politics. The word itself might make you think of modern-day debates or election campaigns. But medieval politics, that was a whole other beast. Imagine the most ruthless, backstabbing soap opera-level drama, but with swords, castles, and lives on the line. For a king, navigating the political landscape was like walking a razor-thin tightrope, suspended over a pit filled with hungry wolves. You might think that being a king means ultimate power, but the reality was far from it. Kings had to juggle a tangled web of nobles, bishops, knights, foreign rulers, the Pope, and even their own family members, all with competing agendas and knives hidden beneath their cloaks. Everyone was scheming, plotting, and waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. Let's start with the nobles. These were the real power players, the king's so-called subjects who controlled armies, land, and money. Some were loyal, many weren't. Each noble had his own ambitions, alliances, and grudges. If a noble felt slighted, maybe you didn't give him the land he wanted or you ignored his petition, he might gather his followers, raise his banner, and start a rebellion. These uprisings were costly and dangerous, and the king's army often had to stomp them out before they spread like wildfire. Then there was the church. Medieval kings lived in a world where religion ruled every aspect of life. The Pope wasn't just a spiritual leader, he was a political heavyweight. Kings had to curry favour with the church, or risk excommunication, which was basically medieval death sentence, cutting you off from your people and giving your enemies the green light to invade or rebel. Take King John of England, who famously clashed with Pope Innocent III and found himself under an interdict that suspended all religious services in his kingdom. That's right, no baptisms, no weddings, no funerals. Imagine running a kingdom where the church tells your subjects, don't listen to your king. Alliances through marriage were another political battlefield. Remember those arranged marriages we talked about? They weren't just about heirs, they were the currency of diplomacy. Marry off your daughter to the French prince, and suddenly you're neighbours, or enemies, with a whole new kingdom. But marriages could also be double-edged swords. A foreign bride brought her own loyalties, advisors, and baggage. Some queens became political powerhouses, others were pawns in a deadly game. Foreign diplomacy was a non-stop balancing act too. Kings constantly negotiated treaties, traded insults, and waged proxy wars to keep their neighbours from invading, or their own nobles from switching sides. One wrong move, and you could find yourself at war with a coalition of enemies who smelled blood. Family feuds? Oh, they were the stuff of legend. Brothers plotting to overthrow brothers, uncles scheming against nephews, and cousins lying in wait. The Wars of the Roses in England, for example, were basically an extended royal family feud with deadly consequences. Kings weren't just fighting outside threats. Often their greatest danger came from within their own bloodline, and the king's council, those advisors who whispered in his ear, were a mixed blessing. Some genuinely loyal, many self-serving. A bad counsellor could ruin a kingdom by pushing foolish policies or selling secrets to rivals. The king had to discern who to trust, which was easier said than done when everyone was motivated by self-interest. Political power in medieval times wasn't about popularity or charisma. It was about survival skills, ruthlessness, and sometimes plain luck. Kings who showed weakness were quickly exploited. Strength could command loyalty, but excessive cruelty might spark rebellion. It was a delicate balance. Maintain enough fear to keep order, but enough favour to keep support. And then there were the symbolic gestures, rituals and ceremonies, crowning, parading, feasts that reinforced the king's legitimacy. These were not just pomp, they were political tools, reminding nobles and commoners alike who held power. Missing a procession or breaking protocol could be interpreted as disrespect or even defiance. Take King Richard II of England, for example. He was flamboyant and loved lavish ceremonies, but his arrogance alienated many nobles. Eventually they rebelled, and he was forced to abdicate. His downfall was a cautionary tale. Politics is not about ego. It's about navigating fragile alliances and power plays. So in short, medieval politics was a ruthless game of chess played with real swords and real lives. The king was the king because he was the best at this deadly dance, at least until he wasn't. Up next, we'll explore the brutal and precarious health risks kings faced. Spoiler: no amount of gold could buy immunity from plague, battle wounds, or medieval medicine. We've navigated the treacherous waters of medieval politics, but now let's talk about something even more personal and terrifying for a king: his own health. Because while you might think kings were insulated from the dangers of their subjects, the truth is, medieval royalty had some of the worst luck with disease, injury, and the so-called medicine of the time. First off, forget the idea of kings living in cushy palaces, protected by layers of velvet and gold. Sure, castles were stone fortresses, but they were also breeding grounds for all kinds of nastiness. Damp walls, cold draughts, rats, fleas, and all the other lovely pests that come with medieval hygiene, or lack thereof. Lords and ladies regularly suffered from chronic respiratory infections, fevers, and worse, with no antibiotics or vaccines in sight. One of the deadliest threats wasn't even visible: the plague. The infamous Black Death ravaged Europe in the 14th century, wiping out up to half the population, including nobles and royalty. No crown could save you from the bubonic plague's cruel bite. Entire royal families were decimated, succession crises erupted, and kingdoms teetered on the brink of collapse. And it wasn't just the plague. Smallpox, measles, dysentery, tuberculosis. These were constant killers, stalking everyone from peasants to kings. When kings did fall ill or got injured, the options were bleak. Medieval medicine was a hodgepodge of superstition, herbal remedies, bloodletting, and prayers. Physicians were often no better than quacks, relying on astrology and humours, the ancient idea that health depended on balancing bodily fluids. So if you had a fever, your doctor might cut you with a lancet or apply leeches to release the bad blood. Sometimes this helped, but more often it hastened death. Battle injuries were a whole other nightmare. Kings were expected to lead their armies from the front, a task as deadly as it was symbolic. A stray arrow, a broken lance, or a sword wound could quickly turn fatal when infection set in. Surgery was primitive, anaesthesia non-existent. Amputations were common, but often without proper sterilisation, leading to gangrene or septic shock. Take King Henry V of England. He was seriously wounded during the Battle of Agincourt, but survived thanks to his robust constitution and luck. Others weren't so fortunate. King Richard III reportedly died with multiple battle wounds, and King Edward II's health was notoriously poor, possibly worsened by neglect and political imprisonment. Even childbirth was perilous. Queens and noblewomen frequently died giving birth, plunging kingdoms into succession crises. A king who lost his queen and heirs risked everything. But beyond physical illness, kings faced psychological pressures too. The constant fear of assassination, betrayal, and failure took a mental toll. Letters and chronicles hint at bouts of depression, anxiety, and paranoia among monarchs, though mental health wasn't understood then, and often hidden behind stoic masks. Privacy during illness? Non-existent. Courtiers, spies, and family members closely watched the king's condition, waiting to see if they could exploit weakness. A sick king was vulnerable politically, and rumours of death spread like wildfire, often fueling rebellions before the body even cooled. Yet despite these grim odds, kings had to present strength. To show fear or weakness was to invite doom. So they wore heavy robes despite fevers, participated in court ceremonies even when pale and trembling, and masked pain with bravado. The irony. With all the wealth, power, and privilege, medieval kings were at the mercy of nature and medieval medicine, just like everyone else. Except their failures had bigger consequences, and no room for second chances. Next time, we'll pull back the curtain on the harsh reality of royal privacy, or rather, the absolute lack of it. Because when your every move is watched, and and your enemies are everywhere. Privacy is a luxury no medieval king could afford. We've just explored the grim reality of medieval kings battling sickness and injury. But now, let's turn to another form of torment that doesn't leave bruises but cuts just as deep. The complete and total absence of privacy. Imagine waking up every single day knowing that your every move, every word, every breath is under scrutiny. Welcome to the medieval king's world. Privacy wasn't just limited. It was basically a fairy tale, something told in legends but never actually experienced by anyone sitting on a throne. Start with the obvious, the court. Medieval courts were buzzing hives of gossip, spies, sycophants and schemers, all watching the king like hawks. Courtiers weren't just there to flatter, they were there to report. Every conversation, every glance, every frown was noted, interpreted and relayed to interested parties. If you thought modern reality TV was invasive, medieval kings were living it 24/7, but without any chance to cut the feed. Even inside the king's own chambers, privacy was a rare luxury. Servants, advisors, guards, all had reasons to be nearby, whether to attend the king or to listen for secrets. Some nobles would station their own spies right inside the palace, masquerading as servants or attendants. This meant that a king had to watch what he said even in his most intimate moments. Gossip wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. Your bedchamber, where you'd hope to find comfort, was often the scene of covert plots and betrayals. There are accounts of guards posted outside the king's door, supposedly for protection, but sometimes with less noble intentions. A whisper overheard, a servant bribed. These small breaches could lead to a king's downfall. Letters? Ha! The king's correspondence was rarely private. Messages were intercepted, read, and sometimes altered by courtiers or rivals. It was a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Writing a letter that displeased the wrong noble or foreign power could mean war, rebellion, or worse. And it wasn't just about enemies. Even family members could be spies. Rival siblings, ambitious cousins, or in-laws with their own agendas often had informants reporting on the king's weaknesses. The royal family was less a source of comfort and more a nest of vipers. Religious figures also played a role. Priests and confessors had intimate access to the king's thoughts and secrets through confession, and some used this knowledge to manipulate or control. The church wielded power not just spiritually but politically, making privacy even more elusive. In public, kings had to maintain an image. Every gesture, every smile, every word was weighed for its political significance. The king was a symbol as much as a person, and symbols don't get private lives. Missteps were magnified, rumours exploded, and enemies sharpened their knives. And then there were the celebrations and ceremonies, all eyes on the king, every movement recorded by chroniclers and minstrels. Privacy dissolved into pageantry and propaganda. Even leisure was public, and leisure activities could be weaponized by rivals. This relentless surveillance meant that kings lived in a constant state of performance and paranoia. Trust was scarce. Loyalty was often transactional. Kings couldn't truly relax or be themselves, and that kind of pressure is exhausting, lonely, and maddening. So if you ever feel like someone's watching your every move, be grateful you're not a medieval monarch. Because back then, even your breath wasn't your own. Coming up next, we'll explore the constant threat of assassination and betrayal, the ever-present shadow stalking every medieval king. Spoiler, it's less about secret daggers in the night, and more about political chess played with deadly precision. We've just seen how medieval kings lived in a fishbowl, watched by friends and foes alike, with no privacy to call their own. But the most dangerous watchers weren't always visible. They were lurking in the shadows, plotting the king's downfall. Assassination and betrayal weren't just frightening possibilities, they were everyday realities. Imagine waking up every morning knowing someone somewhere wanted you dead. And not just a random enemy on the battlefield, but someone you trusted, or thought you did. It's no exaggeration to say that being a medieval king was a constant game of life and death, with the stakes higher than any modern thriller. Assassination attempts came in many forms. Some were subtle poisonings slipped into a goblet of wine or a plate of food. Others were brutal, in-your-face stabbings or arrow shots during battles and ceremonies. Remember that kings had no secret service or bodyguards with bulletproof vests, just loyal knights whose loyalty could be bought or broken. Poison was a favourite weapon because it was discreet and could be passed off as illness. Royal kitchens were battlegrounds in themselves. Servants and cooks were often recruited by nobles looking to eliminate rivals, and food tasters weren't always enough to stop disaster. King Henry IV of France was famously said to have been poisoned repeatedly by his enemies, but survived. Less lucky was King Charles VIII, who died after striking his head, but rumours of foul play circulated for decades. But more often than not, betrayal came from within the king's own court and family. It was common for ambitious relatives to conspire for the throne, whether brothers, cousins, or even sons. The Wars of the Roses is a grim example, where family members hunted each other with cold-blooded efficiency. The line between ally and enemy was razor thin. Sometimes betrayal meant being captured and imprisoned, stripped of power without a single sword drawn. King Richard II of England was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, then mysteriously died in captivity, likely murdered. King Edward II's downfall also came from his nobles' betrayal and abandonment, a brutal reminder that loyalty was never guaranteed. Assassination plots often involved a complex web of conspirators, nobles, clergy, foreign agents, and mercenaries, each with their own interests. Secret meetings, coded messages, and double crosses were all part of the deadly dance, and once a king was weakened by suspicion or injury, his enemies would strike decisively. But kings could fight back with their own spies and informants, building networks to uncover plots before they came to fruition. Still, the stress was immense. Every smile could hide a dagger, every handshake could conceal poison. The paranoia wasn't just political theatre, it was a survival tool. Chroniclers recount kings who barely slept, who constantly changed their routes and schedules, who trusted no one but a handful of loyal guards. Even then betrayals happened. The famous tale of King Macbeth, yes, the one Shakespeare dramatised, may have roots in this very reality. A king assassinated by those closest to him, his throne stolen amid a blur of deceit. So, in the world of medieval monarchy, assassination was less about dramatic sword fights, and more about careful planning, manipulation, and timing. It was a deadly chess game, where one wrong move could mean the king's death. Coming up, we'll explore the pressures of royal education and upbringing, because behind every miserable king was a childhood filled with expectation, training, and no small amount of cruelty. So far we've wandered through the treacherous landscape of medieval kingship, the politics, the betrayals, the assassinations. But before any man could wear the crown, he had to be forged in the relentless fires of royal upbringing and education. And trust me, it wasn't the fairy tale childhood you might imagine. Being born a prince was less about playgrounds and more about preparation for a lifelong nightmare. From the moment a royal child opened his eyes, his life was a calculated investment, a project shaped by tutors, knights, and schemers alike. Spoiled? Sure. Protected? Yes. But free? Absolutely not. Let's start with the expectations. A prince was raised to be a warrior, a diplomat, a judge, a ruler. Basically a multitasking miracle with the patience of a saint and the ruthlessness of a viper. Failure wasn't just disappointing, it was dangerous. A weak or incompetent heir could lead to civil war, foreign invasion, or worse, being replaced by a more ambitious cousin. From infancy, education was strict and relentless. Tutors drilled lessons on Latin, law, chivalry, history, and theology. Learning to read and write was just the beginning. Princes had to master rhetoric and diplomacy, the art of negotiation, and the brutal realities of power. Mistakes weren't forgiven. A slip of the tongue could cost you dearly in a royal court. Physical training was equally harsh. Swordsmanship, horsemanship and hunting weren't just hobbies, they were survival skills. Some royal children trained with real weapons from a young age, enduring bruises, cuts, and exhaustion. The goal? To produce a king who could hold his own on the battlefield and command respect. But education wasn't limited to skill building. It was a lesson in control and emotional restraint. Princes were taught to mask fear, suppress pain, and swallow pride. Qualities essential for ruling, but brutal for a child. Crying in public, unthinkable. Displaying weakness, a fatal flaw. Then there were the psychological pressures. A royal upbringing was isolated. Friends, rare. Play, limited and supervised. Every moment was scrutinised by nurses, chaplains and nobles eager to shape or spy on the heir. The stakes of childhood mistakes were monumentally higher than in common families. Political intrigue wasn't reserved for the adults. Princes learned early that family members could be foes. Tutors and advisors might push agendas, nobles might manipulate lessons to gain favour, and siblings could be rivals with lethal ambitions. The shadow of mortality loomed large. Childhood mortality rates were high even for royalty. Disease could strike without warning. A prince sickly or weak risked losing his place in the line of succession to a more robust brother or cousin. This led to heartbreaking rivalries and sometimes deadly court intrigue. Take King Richard III, who ascended amid rumours and whispers about his brother's suspicious death, a chilling reminder that even royal children weren't safe from deadly ambition. Religious instruction was also intense. Princes were expected to be pious and uphold the church's power, which often meant internalising strict moral codes that could conflict with their human desires and political realities. Despite the pressures, some princes thrived, using their education and upbringing to become formidable rulers, but many others buckled under the weight, producing kings who were indecisive, cruel, or simply unfit for the throne. So when you hear tales of magnificent medieval kings, remember the boy behind the crown who survived a childhood more brutal than most adults' lives. Royalty didn't guarantee happiness. Often, it meant a childhood trapped in gilded cages and heavy expectations. Next, we'll uncover the brutal reality of medieval royal love lives, because behind every crown was a complicated mess of marriages, mistresses and scandal. So, we've travelled through the brutal political games, the constant threat of death, the crushing weight of childhood training, and now it's time to look at one of the most complicated parts of a medieval king's life, his love life. Spoiler alert, it wasn't all romance and roses. In fact, it was often a minefield of duty, deception and drama. First, let's dismantle the Hollywood myth of kings wooing queens with grand gestures and secret rendezvous under moonlit balconies. For most medieval kings, marriage was less about love and more about power, alliance and legacy. Your bride was often a political tool handed to you by your council or nobles, not a partner you chose. Sometimes she was a foreign princess, shipped off with a handful of advisors and a cold stare to seal a treaty or end a war. Romance? That was a luxury few kings could afford. Arranged marriages were frequently brutal for both parties. Young princesses, sometimes barely into their teens, were expected to leave home, adapt to strange customs and produce heirs, often under immense pressure and surveillance. The king might barely know his wife beyond the requirements of producing a male heir. Love? Rarely. Mistresses added a whole other layer of complexity. While kings often kept mistresses, sometimes openly, sometimes in secret, these relationships were political as well as personal. A mistress could wield significant influence, acting as advisor, political broker or spy. But she could also be a rival to the queen, a cause of scandal, and a source of deadly court intrigue. And jealousy. It was never far from the royal bedchamber. Stories abound of queens plotting revenge, mistresses scheming for favour, and nobles exploiting these tensions for their own gain. Poisoning accusations were common, and sometimes a sudden illness was whispered to be more than natural causes. Succession made the stakes even higher. The queen's sons were legitimate heirs, but kings often had dozens of illegitimate children through their mistresses. This created tension not only within the family but across the kingdom. Disputes over inheritance, legitimacy and loyalty could spark civil wars. Take King Henry VIII, centuries later, but emblematic of medieval-style royal turmoil. His obsession with producing a male heir led to 6 marriages, religious upheaval and the execution of 2 wives. While Henry was extreme, his predecessors weren't much gentler. Religious pressures also loomed large. The church held strict views on marriage, adultery and legitimacy, complicating the king's personal choices. Divorces were nearly impossible and often sparked political crises. And don't forget, the king's love life was public property. Scandals spread quickly through gossip, troubadour songs, and chroniclers eager to record royal missteps. A king's reputation for fidelity, or lack thereof, could make or break alliances. Yet some kings found genuine love amid the chaos. These rare relationships offered fleeting moments of happiness and respite from their heavy burdens. But for many, love was a game of strategy, survival and sacrifice. So next time you picture a medieval king with a crown and a scepter, remember the tangled mess of emotions, alliances, betrayals and ambitions behind that regal facade. If you made it this far, thank you for joining me on this journey through the harsh, messy and fascinating life of medieval kings. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. It really helps me keep making these stories for you. Drop a comment below on what historical topic you want me to explore next. Now dim the lights, relax, and let the calming sounds guide you into a deep, peaceful slumber. Good night.